My best friend hugged me and said, "You deserve someone better." Unaware she was sleeping with my husband. I've always been the type to value emotional ties, to protect friendships as if they were my own family. Zoe had been my best friend for almost 20 years. A soul sister confidant, a constant presence through all phases of my life. When my marriage began to silently crumble, it was in her arms that I found solace. And it was precisely in that embrace that my story began to change. What I experienced after that night was a painful journey, full of discoveries that tested my strength, my faith, and my ability to start anew. Amidst silences, losses, and truths I didn't want to see, I had to find within myself the courage I always admired in other women. And when everything seemed to fall apart, I discovered a strength I didn't even know I possessed. Today, my story is about much more than betrayal. It's about identity, overcoming adversity, and the power to rebuild yourself when pain threatens to erase you. No matter where you come from or what you've been through, if you've ever been hurt by those you loved most, you'll recognize yourself in every part of what I've experienced. I'm happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Jeremy had left a few minutes ago, but the sound of the door closing still reverberated within me. I felt small, drowning in a mixture of anger, guilt, and exhaustion. The words exchanged between us still stung, and the silence now was even more painful than the shouts. When Zoe arrived unannounced, as she often did when she sensed my breakdowns, I surrendered to the brief relief of seeing a familiar face. She came in, hugged me tightly, and for a moment I tried to believe that everything would be okay. We sat on the couch and she held my hand tightly, as if she could anchor me to the world. I was trembling and she just kept saying, "Breathe, my friend." The warmth of the tea she prepared contrasted with the coldness inside me. I felt I could cry there without fear, because Zoe had always been my fortress. But that night something about her was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but her care felt more like a performance than genuine affection. She listened to my complaints about Jeremy with overly attentive eyes, looking away during the rawest moments of my pain. When I mentioned he had said I only complained, she remained silent for too long. Then she sighed deeply and said with a firmness that surprised me, "You don't deserve to live like this." I nodded, swallowing my tears, wanting to believe it. Zoe always knew what to say, but it had never sounded so definitive as now. And then she looked me in the eyes with a gleam I didn't recognize, and said what resonated with me most that night. It wasn't a shout nor an accusation. It was just a phrase spoken in a serene, almost maternal tone. But it cut like a sentence. "You deserve someone better," she said. And I believed her. It was impossible not to remember how it all began between us. Zoe and I met at 17, sharing a snack in a college hallway after a disastrous presentation. We became inseparable. She was the one who accompanied me on night shifts, who laughed at my bad jokes, who reminded me to take care of myself. She gave me books for Christmas, helped me choose my wedding dress, and even cried when I walked down the aisle. Our story was made of strong bonds, but over time those bonds loosened. Not because of fights or declared grievances, just nuances I couldn't name. Zoe started showing up less, responding slower, avoiding triple dates with Jeremy. I thought it was a phase, work, adult life. Still, the discomfort grew in silence. And every time I tried to ignore it, something reminded me that this was no longer the same friendship. She remained present, but in a way that seemed too vigilant. Sometimes she would comment on things about Jeremy that I hadn't even noticed myself. Other times she would ask questions that seemed too innocent for someone who knew me so well. I began to notice that in recent photos, there was a tension in my smile and a detachment in hers. Zoe always seemed to know where to tread, but now she walked more carefully, like someone hiding a secret behind every word. That night, after the tea, the comfort, and the sweet words, she said goodbye with a kiss on my forehead. I stayed there, sitting, reliving our memories while feeling something strange in my stomach. It wasn't just sadness over Jeremy. It was an uncomfortable intuition, a silent call for me to re-examine everything. Looking back suddenly seemed essential. Something in her gaze that night seemed different to me. The sound of the lock turning brought me back to the present. Jeremy came in quickly, without looking at me, dropping his keys carelessly on the table. I watched from the corner of my eye, pretending to be distracted by my phone. His face was tense, as if carrying a weight that no longer belonged to me. He didn't even ask if I was okay. He just went upstairs with firm steps, and the bedroom door closed like a wordless goodbye. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound. I walked through the kitchen, idly tidied the dishes Zoe had left, and sat at the table in the dark. The house that was once a refuge now seemed like a box of bad memories. Zoe's words still echoed in my mind, mixing with Jeremy's increasingly frequent silence. There was an abyss between us, and for the first time I didn't try to cross it. I didn't go after him, didn't knock on his door, didn't beg for attention. I just waited. It was as if some part of me already knew that the truth was forming piece by piece before me, and I didn't want to interrupt that process. I preferred to see everything fall into place even if it hurt, because the pain of truth seemed less cruel than doubt. And finally, I understood that silence could also be a strategy. For the first time I decided not to ask, just to observe. There was something different in the air. A kind of anticipation. As if I were on the edge of a cliff about to discover what lay beyond. Jeremy didn't need to say anything anymore. His gestures would speak for him. And when they spoke, I would be there, firm, ready to listen to everything without needing words. Something was about to be revealed, and I needed to be ready. Leaving the clinic, I casually bumped into Wesley near the parking lot. We talked about work until, with the lightness of someone unaware of the weight they carry, he commented, "Funny. I saw Zoe with Jeremy the other day, they seemed quite intimate." I swallowed hard. He described a secluded parking lot, in an area I didn't even know. I disguised the impact with a weak smile, but the ground beneath my feet was already beginning to crack. That couldn't be a coincidence. I tried to change the subject, but my mind was stuck on that image. Zoe and Jeremy too close, away from prying eyes. Wesley didn't seem malicious, just surprised. He even tried to justify it, saying maybe they were planning a surprise. I thanked him for sharing, without letting on the earthquake that was settling within me. When I said goodbye, I realized my hands were trembling, even under the warm afternoon sun. It was as if the truth was beginning to scratch the surface. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I feigned normalcy, smiled in the hallways, attended to patients. But inside something was different. Wesley had planted a doubt, or perhaps he had revealed one that already existed within me. The memory of Zoe's embrace that night came back like a punch. Her care so precise. Now it seemed rehearsed. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. When I got home and saw Jeremy on the couch, typing on his phone with a slight smile on his lips, something broke inside me. It wasn't the first time he smiled at someone else while forgetting about me. I knew that. And even without proof, I felt that smile wasn't mine. My heart wanted to deny it, but my eyes already knew. On Saturday, we went to a dinner at a mutual couple's house. I didn't want to go, but Jeremy insisted, and Zoe would be there. I tried to prepare myself, rehearse my calm, put on my best facade of tranquility. The atmosphere was cheerful, and no one noticed my unease. I watched them with double attention, trying to catch what others ignored. Zoe arrived radiant, greeting everyone with exaggerated affection. When Jeremy and Zoe hugged, it lasted half a second too long. When they sat at the table, they were side by side. Throughout the night, they exchanged brief glances, but there was something more in them. A kind of silent complicity. She knew his favorite dish, finished sentences for him, laughed at jokes that only the two of them seemed to understand. The room was full of voices, but I only heard the two of them. It was as if my world was in slow motion. I tried to find a logical, innocent explanation, but they all sounded too fragile. The Zoe who hugged me was the same one who now seemed too comfortable near my husband, and he showed not the slightest discomfort with it. He avoided my gaze, turned his face away whenever I tried to touch on more personal subjects. At the end of the night, I realized I knew both of them too well not to recognize the signs. And the signs were screaming. At farewell, Zoe hugged me as she always did. But there was a stiffness in her arms. When I pulled away, she smiled, and for an instant, I saw her expression waver. Jeremy got into the car in silence. And I, even more silently, began to piece together a puzzle that was assembling itself before my eyes. She laughed too loudly. He looked away too quickly. The next day, I found an excuse to stop by Maya's house. She offered me tea before I even asked, and as always, she seemed to know more than she let on. I told her about the dinner, about Wesley's comment, about the growing discomfort within me. Maya listened calmly, stirring her spoon in the cup as if calculating each word. After a long silence, she sighed deeply and said, "Are you ready to truly listen?" I nodded. I needed to hear it even if it hurt. Maya then said she had already noticed strange things. That Zoe had been around too much when I wasn't there. That Jeremy had changed his tone of voice when speaking of her, like someone hiding desire behind kindness. She didn't state anything explicitly, but her eyes spoke for her. And my intuition, already on alert, lit up like a siren. It was impossible to continue denying the obvious. Maya held my hand and said, "You're intelligent, Savannah. And sensitive, too. It's okay to doubt those we love. The problem is pretending we don't see." I felt tears well up, but I held them back. I didn't want to break down yet. I left her house with more questions than answers, but for the first time with the certainty that I wasn't crazy. I needed to listen to what my body had been trying to tell me for weeks. When I got home, Jeremy was asleep. And for the first time seeing him there, I didn't feel like lying next to him. I felt like discovering, observing, preparing myself. Zoe, with all her affection, had crossed a line. And Jeremy, he hadn't been by my side for a long time, even if his body still was. That night, I lay alone and closed my eyes with a new kind of courage. Something had changed within me. It wasn't just sadness or fear. It was a silent decision being born. A seed. And I knew that from then on nothing would ever be the same. Trust your instincts, Savannah. They are screaming for a reason. I decided I could no longer live at the mercy of assumptions. I grabbed my coat, waited for Jeremy to leave for work, and 10 minutes later, followed him. I changed my route when I realized he wasn't heading towards the hospital as he usually did. I parked at a distance, watching as he entered a sparsely populated coffee shop. He seemed calm with no obvious signs of guilt, but my heart pounded with every gesture he made. I stayed in the car with the windows partially down. I hid behind sunglasses and waited for a clue, a gesture, an encounter. He stayed there for almost half an hour alone, fiddling with his phone. No Zoe, no revealing scene. When he left, he got into his car distracted and almost dropped his phone. I took a deep breath, frustrated. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was just paranoia. Or maybe he was being too careful. I went home before him, trying to pretend normalcy. When he came in, he dropped his keys and coat on the couch, going straight to take a shower. Only then did I notice something had fallen out of his coat pocket. A receipt. I picked it up carefully, trying not to crease it, and read it slowly. A motel. Recent date. Familiar name. It wasn't much, but it was real. A fragment of truth slipping through my fingers. I held the paper firmly, my heart heavy, and put it back without saying a word. It wasn't time to confront. Not yet. I needed more proof. But something in me was already starting to shatter. A motel receipt fell out of his pocket. 2 days later, Zoe showed up unannounced, as she used to, carrying a bag with a forced smile. "I thought of you when I saw this," she said, handing me a delicately wrapped box. I smiled back, thanked her, but my chest tightened. It was a necklace. And not just any necklace. It was the same one Jeremy had mentioned weeks ago, saying he would buy it for my birthday. I feigned surprise, even though inside I was in pieces. She kept talking, praising the style, saying it suited me, that it was so me. I wanted to ask how she knew, or where such certainty came from. But I kept silent. Her voice was sweet, her gesture kind, but the moment felt scripted. Everything about her sounded too planned. As if she wanted to be seen as perfect, present, caring. As if she was buying my trust inch by inch. I put the necklace back in the box and smiled. I thanked her again and pretended to be moved. Zoe was satisfied, as if she had scored points in a silent game. When she left, I looked at the gift on the table as if it were a disguised trap. The bracelet of affection she put on me was already too tight. And now every gift seemed to carry more than intention. It carried guilt. I picked up the necklace in my hands and remembered Jeremy's words days earlier. "If I could, I'd give you that silver necklace with a blue stone." And now there it was, coming from Zoe's hands. "I bought it thinking of you." But it was exactly what Jeremy had promised to give me. At night, when Jeremy was sound asleep, I risked taking his phone. My heart almost stopped when I managed to unlock it. He never left it unattended. I went straight to the messages, opening recent conversations. Most seemed ordinary, but something caught my attention. Deleted messages. Histories too clean, as if they had just been wiped. I went to the deleted files, and there I saw traces of a conversation with a number saved only as Z. There wasn't much, just confused snippets without full context. A "meet me in the same place?" Followed by "she doesn't know." The screen suddenly darkened, and he mumbled something in his sleep. I put the phone back, my heart beating like a drum. It wasn't enough to confront him, but it was more than I had until then. A trace. A beginning. Confirmation that something existed and was being hidden. I went back to my room and lay looking at the ceiling. The shadow of betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a silent presence inside my house. But I refused to explode without weapons in my hands. Silence now was my strategy. Armor that allowed me to resist until the right moment. I was determined to discover everything to the last detail. Let them be fooled by my calm. The night passed slowly. With every sound I replayed the suspicious phrases, the averted glances, the gifts that smelled of lies. But for the first time I didn't cry. There was a new coldness in me. A kind of strength that only arises when pain no longer fits in the body. And that strength needed more than indications. It needed certainties. Needed more. And I would get it. The name on my cell phone screen made me hesitate for a few seconds. Willow, Zoe's younger sister, rarely called me, even less so outside of holidays. I answered cautiously, and her voice came through low but firm. "Can we meet? It's about Zoe. And you need to know." With a racing heart, I set a meeting at the park near my house. Something about her urgency put me on alert. We met at our usual bench and she seemed different, like someone who had carried a weight for too long. Without beating around the bush, Willow said she had overheard a conversation between Zoe and Jeremy on the phone when she went to her sister's house unnoticed. They were talking about you. About how to manipulate the situation. It wasn't the first time. But this time I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I felt my breath catch for an instant. She looked at me with eyes full of shame, as if apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. "My sister is destroying your life, Savannah. And she doesn't regret it." I swallowed hard, absorbing every word. The pain was real, but there was also a strange relief. Finally, someone was saying aloud what I only dared to think in the dark. And this time it wasn't a supposition. It was a revelation. The betrayal took shape, face, and name. Zoe wasn't just careless with my trust. She was conscious, calculated. And Jeremy, complicit in everything. That embrace she offered me, that phrase that promised me solace, were just disguises. And now before me was Willow, the only bridge that still connected Zoe to any trace of truth. "My sister is destroying your life. And she doesn't regret it." Without waiting for me to ask, Willow opened her phone's gallery and showed me a sequence of screenshots. Messages exchanged between Zoe and Jeremy, with nicknames only the two of them would understand. Dates, times, emojis that nauseated me. Each conversation felt like a stab. And what destroyed me most was the naturalness with which they spoke of me. As if I were the obstacle between them, an inconvenient detail they needed to remove. "Look at this," she said, enlarging an image. It was a message from Zoe. "She'll be on call late, you can come over." The date? It coincided with the night Jeremy said he was in a meeting. Another. "She suspects, but she's still blind." And he replied with laughs and empty promises. My blood ran hot, but my face remained immobile. I couldn't allow myself to break down now. I needed to see everything. Willow spoke with indignation, like someone trying to make up for the silence she had kept for too long. "I never imagined she would be capable of this, Savannah. But I can't protect her anymore." I thanked her, not quite knowing how. That shared pain was a crack in the shield I had built. But at the same time it was a flame lit in the darkness, a flame that would guide me to the truth. The whole truth. Finally I had proof in my hands. She hugged me before leaving, and for the first time, I felt sincerity without falsity or pity. I sat there for a while, reviewing the printouts, taking deep breaths, forcing myself to memorize every detail. The suffering was great, but the disappointment had already turned into strategy. The evidence burned in my hands, but my face remained cold. That night, I gathered all the notes, dates, impressions, and began to assemble a small dossier. I took an old notebook and started jotting everything down dispassionately. Days Jeremy left later, Zoe's visits, out of the blue gifts. I no longer wanted to rely on memory. I wanted proof, structure, facts. Wesley came to mind as someone who could help me, someone outside that triangle of lies. I sent him a message, asking to talk outside of work. He immediately agreed. We met at a discreet cafe. When I told him what I had discovered, his eyes widened. But he didn't interrupt me. He waited for me to finish and then said, "You don't have to do this alone. If you want help, I'm with you." I felt an unexpected wave of relief. I hadn't expected support, but there he was, solid, calm, and true. Counting on Wesley was like breathing after being submerged for a long time. He would help me organize the information, cross-reference data, maybe even track movements. I needed to protect myself, and for that I needed to know. Zoe and Jeremy would no longer manipulate my perception. This was more than a hidden affair. It was a campaign against me, a construction of lies. And I finally was fully awakening. I went home with my head held high. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weak. I felt purpose. I knew there was still much to discover, and that every step would need to be calculated. But now I had allies. I had tools. And above all, I had clarity. If it was a game, I wouldn't be playing alone anymore. Jeremy's office drawer was ajar, as if fate wanted to show me something. I was looking for a bank statement, but what I found made my blood run cold. An envelope with an insurance company's seal caught my attention. I carefully opened it, and inside there was a life insurance policy in my name. The value? Very high. Too high to be just a gesture of protection. I flipped through the pages with trembling hands until I found his signature. Jeremy had signed everything weeks ago, without ever mentioning anything to me. I started to tremble, not just because of the document but because of everything it symbolized. After all, who takes out such a large insurance policy without informing the beneficiary? I began to connect dots that previously seemed disconnected. It was as if a dense fog began to slowly dissipate before me. The man who once promised to love me now seemed capable of much more than lying. I felt fear. Not just any fear, but the kind that settles deep in your stomach and paralyzes you. I carefully put the document back as if handling something radioactive. I took a deep breath, trying to contain the wave of panic that was approaching. I needed to remain calm, think, act strategically. I went back to the room with my heart pounding, feigning normalcy. Jeremy was in the shower, oblivious to the storm I was facing inside. I sat on the bed and closed my eyes for a few seconds. For a second, I feared for my life. The next day, I called Wesley and asked him to meet me urgently. I showed him the document and shared my suspicions. He was silent for a while, as if processing the magnitude of what he was seeing. "This is serious, Savannah. Very serious." I agreed. We then decided to investigate further. Jeremy needed to be exposed, but first I needed to ensure my safety. Wesley, methodical and discreet, managed to access information about financial movements and visit records. And that's how we discovered something even more disturbing. Jeremy had met with 2 different lawyers in the last 2 months. One of them, apparently, refused to continue with him after understanding part of the situation. The other had filed documents whose content we still didn't know. The net was closing in. We got in touch with the first lawyer, and to our surprise, she responded to Wesley's request for a conversation. He recounted it to me later with a serious expression. She said she dropped the case as soon as she realized his intentions. She said she wouldn't condone it. I could barely believe it. What else had he tried to do? What was Jeremy planning behind the scenes, while I slept next to a stranger? This new information made me feel less crazy but more vulnerable. I needed to protect my life. Literally. And at the same time, I needed to be smart. Everything we discovered would have to be documented, recorded, unquestionable. From then on, the urgency to act became fuel. His lawyer dropped the case and said she wouldn't condone it. I went home with a decision made. I grabbed the small recorder we used at the clinic for meetings and hid it behind the living room bookshelf. I positioned it discreetly, with the microphone pointed towards where Jeremy usually made calls. At any moment he could let his guard down. And if he said anything, I would have proof. It was risky but necessary. The kind of risk that only those who live in fear understand to be inevitable. The tension accompanied my every move. Hearing his footsteps around the house was now like living in a minefield. But the disguise had to continue. I kept smiling at the right times, acting as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, I wrote everything down. Times, phrases, silences. Data collection was now part of my routine. I was no longer a betrayed woman. I was a woman in search of her own salvation. Wesley followed every step with caution. We spoke at alternating times, away from any suspicion. He emphasized that at the slightest sign of danger, I should leave the house immediately. I knew that, but I also knew I needed solid proof. Only then could they no longer deny it. Only then would the world believe me, with no room for invented versions. That night, Jeremy arrived late and talked on the phone for long minutes in the living room. My heart pounded, but I remained calm. Every word could be a piece of the puzzle. The recorder was there. Silent. Patient. Like me. Soon they would speak without knowing they were being heard. The storm began with an email. Jeremy called me into the living room with a forced calm tone and asked me to look at some proof he had gathered. I opened the files and saw photos of me with Wesley, entering the same cafe, leaving the clinic parking lot, smiling in a hallway. The angle, the crop, everything seemed meticulously planned. "Do you want to talk about betrayal now?" he said with a rehearsed calm. I laughed bitterly. "Are you following me now?" I asked. He ignored me. He pointed to the images as if they were weapons. But I knew those moments. All harmless. All off-duty conversations without touch, without secrets. He forced a narrative where there was nothing. And, ironically, that only made him more guilty. Someone who lies so much needs distractions, and I was the most convenient target. I took a deep breath and faced him firmly. "Is that all you have? Cropped photos and fear?" He got annoyed but tried to maintain his composure. I knew he expected me to cry, to defend myself, to play along. But my indifference dismantled him. He turned his back and left the room like someone fleeing a mirror. For the first time, I felt his mask beginning to fall. His manipulation no longer hurt me as it used to. It hurt, of course, but now there was a protective layer within me. I was seeing everything from the outside, like someone watching a poorly staged play. Jeremy, once so calculating, now acted on impulse. He was losing control, and that made him dangerous. "Is that all you have? Cropped photos and fear?" The next day, Zoe showed up as if nothing had happened. She arrived with that side smile, impeccable posture, and a voice too sweet to be honest. "I heard you've been quite close to Wesley," she said, like someone casting bait, hoping I'd bite. I didn't answer. She continued, laughing softly, insinuating, leaving hints as if she mastered the game. But I merely observed. She talked too much. And the more she talked, the more she revealed. At one point, she mentioned something about a conversation between Wesley and me that she couldn't possibly know. I pointed it out calmly, and I saw her eyes waver. "Oh, didn't you tell me?" she tried to fix. No, I hadn't told her. And the way she tried to correct herself exposed the flaw in her narrative. For the first time, Zoe stumbled over her own words. Zoe wore a light dress, as if wanting to appear carefree. Jeremy maintained his haughty posture, as he always did when he felt in control. They sat across from me and exchanged complicit glances, as if they were about to console me for something. "Savannah, what happened?" Zoe asked, leaning forward with a soft voice. I simply took a deep breath and said, "Thank you for coming. Let's get straight to the point." The time had come. I opened my bag, took out the envelopes, the USB drive, the printouts. I placed everything on the table with calculated precision. "This is everything you built behind my back. Now it's going to crumble." Jeremy's gaze wavered. Zoe stopped smiling. I went through the evidence one by one without raising my voice. It was no longer emotion, it was justice. I was there as a witness to my own liberation. They tried to justify themselves, stammered out disjointed phrases. But I didn't interrupt. I just kept presenting the facts. They came confident. I came armed with truths. I played the audio of Zoe confessing the affair. Her face paled. "I don't authorize recordings," she said, but it was already too late. The recording played her words, her intentions, her betrayal. Jeremy tried to shift the focus. "You're exaggerating, Savannah. Then I took the life insurance policy from my bag. Is this an exaggeration? He froze. I knew he didn't expect. I said little. They spoke too much. And with each phrase they sank deeper. I showed the screenshots, the messages cross-referenced with the dates of his absences. I confronted their lies with data, their gestures with proof. The cafe fell silent, except for our voices and the cold clicks of truth. Zoe tried to cry. Jeremy called me paranoid. But their narrative no longer held up. They were exposed. Finally, I stood up calmly, stacking the materials in front of them. You built a story about me. Now you will answer for it. I looked into both their eyes, and I saw no regret, only panic. And that, in a way, gave me peace. They never truly loved me. They only liked the silent version of me. But that version died. Another was born with wide-open eyes. Before leaving, I left one last phrase on the table. Didn't you know the mask weighs more than guilt? I went straight to the police station. Wesley accompanied me, discreet but attentive. We handed everything over, the recordings, the insurance policy, the screenshots. The detective listened seriously and took note of every detail. My statement was firm. For the first time, my voice didn't tremble. In the end, she thanked me and promised they would take action. I felt a strange relief, as if I was finally leaving behind something that didn't belong to me. I walked out of the room with light steps. Wesley was waiting for me in the corridor, with the same calm gaze as always. Is it done? He asked. I nodded without saying anything else. In that instant, I didn't need to explain. He knew. And more than that, I knew. It was no longer about revenge. It was about justice, about closing a cycle without leaving open wounds, about saying enough. I looked at the street as I left the police station and felt the air enter my lungs differently. The world was still the same, but I was not. The woman who now walked from there onward was no longer anyone's shadow. She was presence, she was decision, she was truth. I left behind the lies, the disguises, and the fears. The silence that suffocated me was now space. And in that space, finally, I breathed. For the first time, I felt I could breathe. I received the news from Maya, like almost everything that truly mattered in recent times. Zoe turned up pregnant. And guess what? It's Jeremy's. My reaction was not anger nor shock, it was silence. Deep, almost solemn. As if my body had understood before my mind that it no longer concerned me. A few weeks later, Zoe herself contacted me, saying she had filed for divorce. No explanations, no apologies. Jeremy did not seek me out. Perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of simple cowardice. His absence brought me peace, one I had not known for a long time. It was strange to see everything completely crumble. And yet, feel relief. I didn't want their chaos. I didn't want their regret. I just wanted distance. And it finally came as a blessing. Zoe no longer insisted. There were no more messages pretending concern. She disappeared the same way she arrived. Smiling on the outside, destroying herself on the inside. As for Jeremy, his image dissolved like wet paper. Little by little, I untied the invisible bonds that still held me to him. Freedom did not come with shouts, but with the firm silence of someone who chooses herself. I looked around and realized I was alive, whole. Now it was each person dealing with the consequences of their choices. Without the weight of the two of them, I started to feel curious about life again. I found my old notebooks full of forgotten notes and dreams. I had always liked to observe, understand emotions, delve into the pain of others with empathy. Perhaps because I never knew how to deal well with my own. But now I wanted to do it with purpose. I enrolled in an online psychology course. I started slowly but with a sparkle in my eyes. For years, I put off small desires for the sake of relationships that didn't see me completely. Now I saw myself, and that was enough to start. The classes became a refuge and internal reconstruction. I read clinical cases, studied theories, but deep down it was my own traumas I was unraveling. Pain seen from the outside had another color. And I wanted to learn to transform that into help. I started writing reflections about my process. Not as therapy but as observation. Something in me wanted to organize the pain into words. As if giving meaning to the chaos was a form of healing. Nights were no longer filled with insomnia, but with ideas. Solitude no longer scared me. I was keeping myself company. And that was enough. For the first time I felt useful to myself. Perhaps this was the path I ignored while trying to save what was beyond repair. Perhaps my pain can heal others. Wesley remained present, without invading, without forcing. He appeared with books, coffee, and comforting silences. Our conversations ranged from movies to childhood memories, always unhurried. There were no demands, no promises. Just a sincere exchange between two people who had survived silent pains. With each encounter, something settled within me, and I saw in him a calm, secure human mirror. We walked through the park in the late afternoons, watching the leaves fall without saying much. Sometimes he would hold my hand, and that was enough. There was no need for explanations because there, between steps and pauses, a new language existed. That of presence. We didn't need to fill voids with declarations. Just being there was enough. And that was more than I had had in years of empty promises. I started to like seeing him arrive. And even more, to know that he wouldn't demand anything. Affection was born of respect, listening, lightness. He didn't try to fix me. He just walked by my side as I rebuilt myself. And because of that, perhaps he was the first man for whom I didn't have to diminish myself to be accepted. With him, I could continue to be myself. Nothing was said out loud yet. But I knew. Something new was beginning, without haste but with truth. The circle was small, welcoming, formed by women who knew what it was to start over. That night, I was invited to share my story. 8 years had passed, but as I began to speak, I realized my voice no longer trembled. I spoke of the silences, the betrayals, and the reconstruction. And in the end, I looked around and said firmly, I survived, but more than that, I flourished. After the chaos, I faced months of silent reconstruction. Depression tried to swallow me, but I discovered roots I never imagined I had. Today, I have a degree in psychology and work supporting women in vulnerable situations emotionally. I found in Wesley a partner who walks beside me, not ahead of me, nor behind. And more than that, I learned to love my own company. I no longer trade my peace for empty promises. Life took its course. There are sunny days and cloudy days, but they are all mine. From a distance, I still see Zoe and Jeremy together, at least on paper. Their sparkle faded with time, like a poorly painted facade that couldn't withstand the rains. There is no hatred, only distance. And in the silence of that distance, I found my place. They remain trapped in their own web. And I, finally free. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced anything similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.